Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will begin very shortly. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Bharat Ramamurti. I'm the Managing Director of the Corporate Power Program here at the Roosevelt Institute. We have a great keynote speaker today and great panelists, so I just want to get right into it. Today's event is about a simple question: who are corporations accountable to? Should corporations focus solely on providing value to shareholders, or should they also have meaningful obligations to consider the interests of their workers, the communities they operate in, and the environment? This question has enormous implications for corporate decision-making and, as a result, how trillions of dollars flow through our economy. Our goal today is to explore the costs and benefits of the current approach to corporate accountability and consider various ideas for reform to produce a more just and inclusive economy. With that, let me turn it over to Felicia Wong, who's the president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, thank you, Bharat. Thanks everybody for joining us. It is my great pleasure to welcome Representative Khanna, actually my congressman, or my parents' congressman, from the great District 17 of California. Representative Khanna is a leader in the field of corporate accountability, so we're pleased to have his keynote today. He is co-leading the Reward Work Act in the House, which bans stock buybacks and empowers workers to elect a third of the members of corporate boards. He's also the lead sponsor of the Stop Walmart Act, which would ban companies from engaging in buybacks unless they pay workers a living wage, provide paid leave, and rein in executive compensation. All of these are ideas that you'll hear much more about from our panelists today, but for now, I'm going to turn it over to Representative Khanna for our keynote. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Felicia, and thank you for the kind introduction and all your counsel over the years. I've known Felicia and your work for well before I was in Congress, when I was back in the Obama administration, and think so highly about you personally and the Roosevelt Institute, and an honor to really be able to share some thoughts. I think we have to start out with a very simple fact, and that is that over the last 40 years or so, worker productivity has increased dramatically, but wages have not followed. And the reason that's important is this is not just an issue of economic justice. I mean, people say, well, folks have been left behind, and how are you going to make sure that they get their appropriate just share? This is actually much broader. It is, why is the economy working in a way that people who are adding value are not being able to capture that value? I mean, a basic economic theory should be that you are compensated based on your productivity. And the importance of this insight is to make it clear that there's something going on beyond globalization and beyond automation and technological change. Because if it was simply a matter of saying that wage disparity is being caused because of technology and automation, then you would expect that the people who were having higher worker productivity because they were using some of this technology would be getting compensated better. And you could say maybe it's having a displacement effect, but you would have a sense that worker productivity going up would mean more wages. But that's not the story we have seen. And similarly, in cases of globalization, you could say, yeah, that should have some impact, but it doesn't explain this gulf between productivity and a lack of wage raises. So what does explain that gulf? I believe that most of the economic research suggests the gulf is because you have had the gains of an economy disproportionately go to shareholders, disproportionately go to executives, and not go to appropriately to the people who are also creating value as workers. And that has nothing to do with economic efficiency. That is simply behavior that is focused simply on taking rent-seeking behavior and how we're how the gains are being allocated. And this is the fundamental challenge in our society. Why is it that workers, even when they're doing everything right, are losing out? And I'll look forward to the panel's conversation about it, but I have some views. First, it is because of the way corporations have been structured and the board of directors approving executive compensation and having to look at shareholder maximization as the primary interest. And so there isn't an incentive necessarily to have a long-term concern for a community or for workers. And there is simply a sense of how are you going to maximize the value immediately of shareholder prices, and how are you going to compensate CEOs and managers for doing that? Because what is a few $1 million or $10-20 million if that means that those people who you're compensating are being able to generate hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of shareholder value return for a corporation? People will say, well, shouldn't the shareholder valuation be the primary metric for judging the success of corporations? Well, partly because corporations get public benefits. I mean, we as a society say corporations are able to raise capital in a certain way. We say that people are not going to be personally liable if they form a corporation. We give them benefits in how they can employ others and how they can conduct contracts. So they are benefiting from society. So to think that they have no obligation then to society, to the workers and the community in which they reside is just not a fair reading of the benefits that they get. And it's a recent view, this focus on just shareholder profits at all other expense. And so what we need to do, in my view, is move beyond a model that just looks at shareholder maximization. I also don't think shareholder maximization necessarily means long-term profits, because I don't think investors are taking that long-term rational view on what type of research and what type of development may create returns well down the road. And they tend to be much more short-term players that are looking for getting the bottom line, not looking at how they develop a robust workforce and a loyal workforce and have research and development. And so it's not just that it's hurt the community and the stakeholders. It in some cases has hurt corporations as well, and it's hurt certainly a sense of social mobility, where there is this huge incentive for workers to be offshored or outsourced if they are not part of the company's core function, and so they lack upward mobility. They are lacking a proper wage. and the corporation really becomes this profit maximizing entity for shareholders instead of a fully value creating entity. So those are some of the questions, the challenges. So how do we solve this issue? And I certainly, there are people far smarter than me who have written about these topics, and I look forward to the panel's thoughts, but I suggest a few things. The Stop Bezos Act that we had, and similarly the act about Walmart's corporate responsibility, talks about making sure that people are being paid a $15 minimum wage or higher, and if they aren't, then corporations don't get away with letting other people pay public benefits. And that is really what's happening right now when we're subsidizing public benefits for these huge corporations, and they aren't paying a fair wage. Now, people said, when Senator Sanders and I initially introduced the Stop Bezos Act, they said, oh, you can't do that because if Amazon raises its wages, you're just going to encourage automation and they're going to hire less people and you're going to hurt the economics. Well, guess what? Since they announced the $15 raise of minimum wage, they've hired more workers, 100,000 more workers. So they obviously have not automated, and that argument was just false, that somehow the higher wage is going to result in automation. And you can have strong anti-discrimination provisions to make sure that companies aren't discriminating against those who need benefits to prevent that. But the point is that we need to be raising wages to make sure that they are in line with the productivity gains. And there are very few of these jobs that can be just fully automated. What we have allowed for, because of the decline of collective bargaining, because of boards of directors that are focused just on executive compensation, is that the gains are being unfairly distributed to shareholders and executives at the expense of the value that workers are creating. So giving them higher wages workers is not going to result in some mass automation of jobs. And the historical record is that that's not what has happened when wages have gone up. Having workers have a seat at the table on the board of directors, which is what the bill calls for, would basically ensure that not only are you having some consideration of their wages going up, you're having some consideration of how technology is used. So workers have a voice in their own training. So workers have a voice in how technology can be empowering and not displacing. And that, I think, is critical for workers to be part of the process of the governance of a corporation. Given that they're a third, they can still be outvoted, and it doesn't mean that they're going to have veto power, but they're going to have a seat at the table for a corporation to consider the interests of people who've been adding value but haven't gotten their due. The other aspect to large companies is Nick Hanauer's proposal, which I think is very intriguing, on having progressive standards based on a company size. So what he says is, okay, if a company's $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, maybe the living wage can be higher for those companies. I mean, certainly companies like Amazon, Walmart, others can afford to be paying their workers more than probably a small business or even a 500 or 1,000 person company. Now, you want to make sure that good jobs are everywhere and not exempt 500-person companies from good jobs. But if we could have some of our biggest employers, our biggest corporations creating good-paying jobs, then that is something that we ought to do. I mean, right now there's the sense that if you work for Amazon, if you work for Walmart, even though these are some of the richest companies in the world, you may not be able to even be part of the middle class or afford a house or afford to make ends meet in a way that is reasonable. And the reason for that is so discouraging. I mean, think about this. You're working at one of the richest companies ever because you're at a fulfillment center or you're doing deliveries, and you don't partake in the benefits of that corporation. Now imagine if you did. I think there would be a different attitude in this country towards wealth creation, if that wealth creation benefited workers, if the wealth creation benefited every employee. I mean, imagine if you had a certain stock in addition to wages if you worked at one of these companies. The corollary to that is we need to have much stronger joint employer rules and go back to the pre-1984 standard with the NLRB, where you would be, if you're driving buses for Google, or if you're cleaning buildings for Apple or Walmart, you're considered an employee. And you can't have this fiction that you're a contractor, which has allowed for these companies to avoid having to raise wages and or to provide proper health care, and has created again this growing rift between wealth creation and the working class. So having a joint employer standard, I think, is critical, and it's in the House legislation that we passed. The PRO Act talks about going back to a joint employer standard that was there pre-1984. So if you have a joint employer standard and get rid of this challenge of just outsourcing all lower income work, if you have people on the boards of these companies so that you're being able to raise wages, if you have a progressive standard where the larger your market cap, the higher wage you need to pay, those provisions in themselves would go a long way. Of course, having a $15 floor for a minimum wage, I think, would put upward pressure as well. And then having stronger bargaining rights and the ability to unionize and form unions is critical. Well, what else can we do to help mitigate this gap? I think healthcare is a key thing. If you look at Deaton and Case's work, they point out, I think, brilliantly, that the rise of healthcare costs and healthcare premiums are part of the reason for outsourcing companies. It's one thing if you're, a senior executive at Apple making $500,000 to have a company pay $25,000 in healthcare premiums. It's a very different thing if you're making $40,000 for that company to justify paying $25,000 of healthcare. And so what they do is they outsource that job at the low wage level, and those jobs actually become even lower paying without proper healthcare benefits. If we had healthcare for everyone in this country, for Medicare for all, it would actually do wonders in raising wages, because so much of the salary depression in this country, as Deaton and Case point out, is directly tied to the rents that the healthcare industry is sucking out and those premiums. And it would also, frankly, make our businesses more competitive. I mean, they don't want the massive escalation of those rents. So solving, I think, the healthcare issue, in addition to these reforms in corporate governance, are critical. Let me end on two notes. One, of course, Leo Strine, who I'm sure the panel is very familiar with, has done incredible work on this short-termism and how do we reimagine corporations to create opportunity and wealth, and not just for the executive class, not just for the professional class, but for the working class. And some of the rule changes he proposes, that at a time where capital is having huge returns, we shouldn't be favoring a tax code that privileges capital over labor. I mean, all the depreciation we're able to get tax credits, but we're not able to get credits for worker training or worker investment. I think those are very important considerations, and I'd recommend Strine's work. I'd recommend Gene Sperling's book, Economic Dignity, that recently takes on a lot of these issues, and Abhijit Banerjee, Good Economics for Hard Times, a Nobel laureate, who talks about the need for the interventions with a corporate free market absolutism that has not worked, that is not leading to the types of gains that the economic models would predict. And I think that, let me end on that note. I mean, I call myself a progressive capitalist, and by that I mean I'm a big believer in entrepreneurship. I'm a big believer in economies of scale. I'm a big believer in innovation. I'm a big believer that we want to encourage risk-taking. But when there are systematic failures, when you have workers who have been left out and aren't participating in the wealth, when you have had regions that have been left out, when you have gross economic disparity because of rent-seeking behavior that is not compensating people for the value that they're creating, then you need smart government intervention to have markets work in a way that adds value for communities and adds value for workers and the middle class. And this is a challenge for us to do this, not just to do it because it's economically needed, but also if we have any hope of preventing a greater alienation in our body politic, a greater polarization in our body politic, and try to stitch this country back together and to help embrace a politics of inclusion and pluralism. I think it depends on people feeling that they have a stake in the modern economy, which they currently lack. So I think the work the Roosevelt Institute is doing and your panel is doing is so important to think about the reforms that we need on this critical issue, so that the working class and middle class will benefit from the corporate sector and from our economic activity. And I look forward to hearing from the panelists and your report.
Thank you, Congressman Khanna. That was really great. Really interesting ideas, and I highly agree with the outside reading recommendations that you made as well. I want to get thoughts on what the Congressman said and more from our great panel. And we're lucky today to have 5 panelists with us for about a 45-minute discussion on this topic. First, we have Janie Grice, who is a United for Respect leader and a former worker at Walmart, where she led efforts to improve conditions for her fellow employees. Rose Marcario is the former CEO of Patagonia. Keith Mestrich is the president and CEO of Amalgamated Bank. Lenore Palladino is an assistant professor of economics and public policy at UMass-Amherst and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. And lastly, we have Leo Strine of Counsel at Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, and the former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court. So let me start with the basic idea of shareholder primacy. And as Representative Khanna said, this is a fairly new concept. In the early 1980s, the Business Roundtable, which represents many of the biggest companies in America, issued a statement that said that the goal of the corporation was to provide high quality goods and services to customers and to take care of their workers, to serve their communities, and to provide a good return for shareholders. By the mid-1990s, though, the Roundtable had a different view. Its statement then said that the only goal of the corporation was to maximize returns to shareholders. So, Leo, I'll start with you. How do you think this shift took place over time, and what has that meant for how corporations make decisions?
I want to echo, I think, not just because I paid him to give me a good shout out, but the Congressman intro actually anticipated what I was going to say. Rob, one of the things I just think we got to understand that this is not a novel debate. Actually, it's a long-standing debate in American corporate governance and around the world, and it goes back a long way. I think what's given it its current salience, this is in some ways occasioned by the 50th anniversary of an essay by Milton Friedman, where he said businesses should just focus on profits within the rules of the game. I'm not a big Milton Friedman fan, but I don't want to just blame him. He was advocating for a view that many people had. Interestingly, at a time when capitalism in the form of the New Deal / European social democracy was more successful than ever. He wrote in 1970, at a time when there was greater inclusiveness throughout what was then called the Western world, where, to be honest, Black Americans were finally getting to share in some of the benefits of inclusion. And we were a much more equal thing, and when there was general happiness. So it was a weird time for him to write, Bharat, but as you know, he anticipated people like Ronald Reagan. And I think the thing that I think that Congressman kind of put the basic thing that I think it characterizes on the table. if you draw an arrow upward, Bharat, and say the power of the stock market over companies, hugely accelerating arrow up, and then an arrow going down with particularly the leverage of working people, but of other corporate stakeholders, that would characterize economic policy since the Reagan era. And I don't think corporate law itself has changed so much, Bharat. I think, it's always been the case that corporate law is sort of stockholder focused, right? The stockholders elect the board, but a lot of things have changed about stockholders. Stockholders used to live in their community. They were actually human beings. And it was really difficult for companies to succeed unless the whole community gained in some way, unless you employed people. Since this time, we've done a lot of things, which is not only is there this teaching that what corporation boards ought to do in the US is just focus on stockholders, is we've really made it impossible for them to do otherwise. We blame the company boards, but the reality is, who elects them? It's the stockholders. Who are the stockholders? They're big institutional investors. What are the pushbacks that help companies? Well, unionization has gone down. We've made it harder for unions to have leverage or voice. So they have less power, and the government doesn't enforce the power of workers. We've seen what's happened to environmental protection and others. And so I think if we want to have this discussion in a rich way, we've got to really focus on all the power dynamics. And I'll put one on the table, is how are we, and many of us on this call are people of the left. People of the left have caused the need for acts like Congressman Khanna have introduced. What do I mean by that? Every managed to the market agenda pushed by institutional investors in the last 30 years has been supported by Democrats in Congress. And so every time, as you know, Bharat, there were proposals to make it easier to make boards essentially have referendums on every issue. Democrats were on the side of that equation. That including the argument that CEOs should be paid in stock options. That includes the argument that we should have votes on everything all the time. And when you put more power in the hands of the stock market, then it's not surprising that you have the kind of myopia that we have. And so I think it's a real opportunity for us all to reflect on the great lessons of the New Deal and holding everyone accountable, and a real focus on what we can do to make the people who control most Americans' capital more responsive, which is institutional investors, and then create an external framework where there's not only power for workers within the company, and we can talk about those ideas, but frankly, where there's external boundaries that are more like what characterized things before the Reagan Revolution took them down.
Yeah, thank you. And I totally agree that this is a more complicated than just a legal obligation, more complicated than a cultural change. There are a lot of intersecting trends that have taken place over the last 40 years. So, the next question is, last year, in fact, almost exactly a year ago, the Business Roundtable, which I mentioned, released a new statement of corporate purpose with a lot of fanfare. And remember, previously it had said that the only goal was to maximize returns to shareholders. Last year it said the goal of the corporation is, and I'm quoting, delivering value to our customers, investing in our employees, dealing fairly and ethically with our suppliers, supporting the communities in which we work, and then finally generating long-term value for shareholders. So now we've had about a year to see what, if anything, has changed at the dozens of major companies that signed on to this statement. I know, Lenore, you've looked closely at this data. In your view, did the statement result in significant changes in how big corporations operate?
In a word, no. So first of all, thanks to everyone who's watching today. I'm really glad that people are taking the time out of their busy days to participate in this conversation, and of course to all the panelists and Representative Khanna. As you're saying, Bharat, the statement was really seen as some kind of major shift, moving away from the last few decades of shareholder primacy to a new era of stakeholder capitalism. The statement said, quote, each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to deliver value to all of them. Jamie Dimon, who was the chairman of the BRT at the time, said that he hoped the declaration would, quote, set a new standard for corporate leadership. Although it's also worth noting he came out a week or so after the statement was released with an op-ed that stated that there was no need for public policy reform on these issues. Instead, these are my words, but the American public should rely on corporate leaders to ensure that multiple stakeholders are served. So as you're pointing out, the question is whether the statement signaled an actual change in priorities by the corporate executives who signed on. Did they make different decisions about how they use the corporate value that they're creating in terms of the disparities between executives and worker compensation, the kinds of shareholder payments that they're engaged in, et cetera. So I did an analysis of the corporate financial data of the 188 BRT member companies to see if there were any meaningful changes in their decision-making during the end of last year and the beginning of 2020. So really post-BRT statement and pre-pandemic, because really post-March, things are pretty different. And in short, I saw no change. BRT companies on average continued to prioritize shareholder payments, making high levels of stock buybacks, meaning high levels of stock buybacks and dividends, really at the same levels they had prioritized them for the entire previous decade. Stock buybacks actually continue to rise as a ratio of assets through the first quarter of 2020. Long-term debt continued to rise, while there was really no appreciable pickup in investment. Companies don't have to disclose wages publicly, but we know there are multiple worker movements, including represented on our panel, who are calling for decent wages and benefits from many of the BRT member corporations. So in short, no, I don't think that signing onto the statement meaningfully changed corporate decision-making by corporate leaders. Let me just, if I can, talk briefly about one other important aspect of shareholder primacy. I think that it's really valuable to bring in the relationship between shareholder primacy and the racial wealth gap. So the wide disparity in corporate equity ownership means that shareholder primacy almost entirely benefits white households. I'll just give you, I'm an economist, so I'll give you a little data. According to the Federal Reserve, as of the first quarter of 2020, 92% of corporate equity wealth is owned by white households. Less than 2% is owned by Black households and less than 2% by Latinx households. I found in my own research that the disparity in corporate equity ownership is accounting for a growing proportion of the racial wealth gap over time. So the problem is getting worse, not better. So to me, this means that, that the ongoing corporate prioritization of shareholders will continue to drive economic and racial inequality in America unless we put in place true policy reform and corporate governance.
Yeah, thanks, Lenore. That's fascinating research and sobering. So let me shift now to the question of how does this affect the millions of people who work at these companies? So Janie, for those of you who may not know, worked for 4 years as a cashier and a customer service manager at Walmart. In 2018, she filed a shareholder proposal at Walmart's annual shareholders meeting to ensure that Walmart's hourly associates would receive a share of the profits from the corporation's billions of dollars in stock buybacks. Although her proposal didn't pass, it sparked a worker-led movement to reform the way that corporations operate. So we're thankful to have her here today. Janie, how do you think this focus of big corporations on maximizing returns for shareholders ends up affecting the lives of working people across the country?
First, I just want to thank you for having me here today. And thank you for that question. I speak with Walmart associates daily, and the issues we discuss are directly related to the harms caused by shareholder primacy, which grossly enriches wealthy shareholders through stock buybacks at the expense of Walmart associates. Before joining UFR, I worked at a local Walmart as a cashier and later as a customer service manager, raising my son as a single mother. Today, I'm speaking for the 1.4 million Walmart associates and millions of other low-wage and underpaid workers. When I started working for Walmart, I was part-time, making only $7.78 an hour. In my 4 years there, I never got a full-time position, let alone a stable schedule. Do you know how hard it is to spend time with your family or pay your bills when you have no clue how many hours of work you're going to get or when you're going to work? I always had to choose my job at Walmart over time with my son, because without that income, even as low as it was, we wouldn't be able to afford basic necessities. This is why I was so mad when I read about the $20 billion in buybacks Walmart gave their rich executives and the Walton heirs. Lenore Palladino's research shows that $10 billion in buybacks that Walmart authorized could have been used to give 1 million associates a $5 hourly wage increase, I don't mind investors making profits, but I do mind when Walmart associates who have been putting the work in day after day, year after year, do not get to share in those profits. Right now, an average Walmart associate's starting pay falls below the federal poverty line for a family of 3. How shameful is that Walmart employees have to live in poverty while working for the largest and wealthiest employers in the world? Think about what Walmart and corporate America would look like if workers actually had a seat at the table. We would more fairly invest corporate profits and reduce associate turnover. Many associates could finally get off of public assistance and provide for their families. This is exactly why I filed a shareholder proposal at Walmart's 2018 annual shareholders meeting that would have rewarded hourly associates by giving them a share of buyback profits. Although my proposal did not pass, I started a real conversation about how corporations like Walmart need to make a difference in more inclusive choices. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and share your view about how powerful a difference it could make in the lives of millions of people if we just shifted even a little bit the way that corporations operate. So we're fortunate to have the perspective as well of 2 executives at corporations that took a different approach on these issues. Keith runs Amalgamated Bank, and Rose used to run Patagonia. Both are highly successful companies, but both are also what are known as benefit corporations or B Corps. Just to give you a little bit of background on those, 36 states currently offer laws that allow companies to receive a corporate charter as a B Corp. As a B Corp, these companies are legally required to consider the impact of their decisions on workers, on customers, suppliers, the community, and the environment, so not just shareholders. Rose, I'll start with you, and then we can go to Keith. How does the shareholder primacy approach affect the way that corporate leaders make decisions about compensation and investment and offshoring and supply chain management? And how do you think that's different when you're operating under a B Corp structure instead?
Yeah, well, thanks, Bharat. Thanks for having me here. And I want to say first, the Business Roundtable statement was last year, I think about this time, and we've basically seen nothing come from it. And to me, that's just a function of the fact that there's 0 teeth in that statement. These things that are so important to shifting the gap from being so focused on, Representative Khanna talked about the gap that was created, the wealth gap. And it's like what created that gap was greed, plain and simple, and not sharing wealth with your employees in your supply chain. And so shareholder primacy has been really bad for human health, for human happiness, for public health, for clean air, for clean water, for clean soil. And, it's going to kill us if we don't get it right. And it's on its way to killing us. And this huge gap that only rewards these very short-term actions. I mean, the fact that we even look at things on a quarterly basis. I mean, I ran a company that's over $1 billion. You don't look at anything in a quarter, really. You're making decisions much more for the long term. And I think what's happened is there's no commitment from the Business Roundtable on the things that are important. Let's just start with really measurable things. 1, pay your fair share of taxes. I mean, Amazon, Apple, I can go on a long list that have made billions, trillions in profits and paid very little taxes. Those taxes go into the community. They go into the federal treasury to help with programs. And they're getting away with murder by not paying their fair share of taxes, for starters. Paying employees a living wage, healthcare, paid family leave, taking responsibility for your product from end to end. If you're creating environmental destruction when you make your product, you need to be held accountable for that throughout the supply chain and throughout the product you deliver. So I think the difference between being driven solely by one investor or one group of investors, it's proven itself to be an unmitigated disaster, I think. And unless we change the course and go to something like a benefit corporation structure that gives you a legal structure, that gives you a fair and equitable test across all the companies to measure themselves. I mean, you can't rely on the company to measure themselves and, you know, report on themselves. There has to be some collective group that does that. You know, that's where I think the benefit corporation has a really nice, you know, group of companies that really want to make serious change. I mean, we are hurtling towards disaster for the planet, for people, this huge wealth gap. And if we don't fix it, and we have to fix it soon with a sense of urgency, and that's the other thing missing from the Business Roundtable's statement. It's been a year. There's zero sense of urgency about it. We have to act now. And I think that there's a lot that we can do. I worry sometimes that we focus too much on CEO pay and things like that when we're not focusing on taxation. And another thing these companies can do is step up and agree to a wealth tax, because there's been this huge transfer of wealth that now $30 trillion of wealth is going to be passed over the next generation to a bunch of rich heirs, you know, and there needs to be some that needs to be broken down and taxed. I mean, that's just the bottom line. So anyway, that's my point of view about it. I feel like we have to hold these bigger companies accountable through legislation, through public shaming, through whatever it takes to get us there, you know? So.
Keith?
Thanks, Bharat, and thanks to my colleagues on the panel. You know, you pointed out, Bharat, that Patagonia and Amalgamated share a lot in common, and Rose and I have had a chance to share some of our stories in the past, and we do have a lot of things in common. We have one fundamental difference, and that's that Patagonia is a privately held company, and Amalgamated Bank is traded on the public stock exchanges. And there's reasons companies seek out listing on the public stock exchanges, if for no other reason, it's the relative ease of being able to raise money to have the capital to grow. So there's reasons people do it, and it makes sense to do that. I will tell you that my job as a publicly traded company CEO would be so much easier if all I did was care about shareholder primacy, because that's how the whole system is built. The whole system is built, you know, Rose sort of referenced it. It's all built on this quarterly cadence of measuring your quarterly results and looking at them, and then running through a whole series of meetings with shareholders and investors and analysts to really talk about how you did compared to your peers in the publicly traded markets. And it's really comes down in so many ways to that. How did I do vis-a-vis my peer group, other banks of a similar size that are publicly traded? And if our company met those results, we are rewarded well by the stock market. Our stock price goes up, and compensation systems are built so that executives are rewarded if their results are favorable in comparison to their peers, but only on one metric, and that really is on profitability metrics. Really, it's what did you do from a return on assets perspective? What did you do on a return from equity perspective? How good was your expense ratio, and a number of other things. And I am almost never asked, how did the company do when it comes to its workers in any given quarter? What did the company do to give back to the community? So there is nothing in the incentive system, right, that rewards that kind of behavior. And Rose's comments that the BRT statement had no teeth is really true. The only reason as a publicly traded company that we've been able to change our organization certificate recently to be a benefits corporation, or to mimic the attributes of a benefits corporation, and the only reason we got shareholder approval to do that was because we have a business plan which is built in providing a set of services really to people who care about all those things, and they expect that of us. And so we were able to convince shareholders, if you will, that there was an absolute benefit to our business strategy, you know, of doing that. There's only a handful of companies that can do that. There are some. But there's a lot of companies that would never have a market constituency that would do that. So until we bring those values into the mainstream and get the markets to appreciate the need for this, it's going to be really a challenge to do. And it's not going to happen on its own. It really will require changes in the regulations that the SEC does in terms of overseeing companies, and changes in public policy that put this at the forefront of things. And so it's got to be all those things, because while companies, some of them will do it on their own, they're going to have to be forced to really take on those responsibilities.
Great, that's a great transition to our next set of questions, which is what are the types of changes that make sense for these companies? And in the time left, we have about 6 different areas for reform. Hopefully we can spend about 5 minutes on each of these. And my hope is that we can have an open discussion about each of these ideas. So the first one is to find different ways to empower workers more in corporate decision-making. As Leo mentioned in his remarks, we've seen a steady disempowering of workers over the last 30 or 40 years, including decline of unions and so on. In many other countries, workers are empowered to elect corporate board members. In contrast to America, of course, where only shareholders elect board members. Other countries have what are called works councils, which is a body that represents workers in discussions with the board on corporate decisions. And of course, a unionized workforce itself can play a powerful role in corporate decision-making. So I'll start with Lenore on this, and then, as I said, everyone should feel free to weigh in. What do you think are the most effective ways to empower workers in corporate decisions here in America?
Yeah, great question. I think that, of course, supporting the ability and right of workers to collectively bargain is essential. I've become personally very interested in a complementary policy for workers to be able to participate in the corporate boardroom. And that's in part because of the different types of decisions that are made at the bargaining table versus in the boardroom. So we have certain kinds of business decisions that actually aren't subject to collective bargaining under our labor laws. As you said, Bharat, throughout Europe, workers do participate on corporate boards. They elect board members and they serve in that role with a responsibility to look out for the health of the whole company as well as the workforce. And there's lots of great empirical research that shows the benefits not only to the workforce, but actually to the company's long-term productivity, to the company's capital formation, and shows that it's not nearly as adversarial or confrontational as I think many Americans would sort of knee-jerk reaction think that kind of dynamic would be created. It turns out to be a very positive and productive working relationship. And I would just point folks, maybe we'll hear about it in a minute, but there's been a couple recent shareholder resolutions by worker organizations that called on companies to bring workers onto the boards. And when you read those and you step back and you think about it, it's really common sense. Workers are the people with the day-to-day experience of the company's operations, of the company, the needs of the company's customers. They know what needs to happen. And so it seems to make a tremendous amount of sense to have that voice really participate directly in the boardroom.
Leo, I know you have a slightly different perspective.
I actually, if my dream for the US would be that we had completed the New Deal vision and that we actually had European style co-determination. The only difference I have from my friend Lenore is just whether I think whether we're ready to go immediately to the top level of co-determination without the core of co-determination. The core of co-determination is actually what you mentioned, Bharat, at the Works Council level. And in Europe, whether you have a union or not, there is worker voice because there's a Works Council and it goes from the ground floor up. And as Lenore said, it goes into issues like family-friendly schedules are actually a subject for Work Council discussions in Europe, Janie. So the workers at each establishment in Europe are at the seat at the table to talk about the issues you are concerned about. Layoff policies. Frankly, the workers also take responsibility as part of what Lenore is saying, because when you're running it, they actually are involved in dismissals, which means they actually are more likely to, frankly, hold people accountable. We don't have any of that in the US because of our history of anti-unionism. So one of the things that I support, and look, I would be for workers on boards. There's a lot of implementation issues, but to go along with it, I'd like to see a board level committee required. And that would fit with American corporate governance that's being done in the UK. And to take the compensation committee of the companies, Bharat, instead of them just focusing on the top C-suite, have them actually be a full-blown workforce committee that looks at the way you treat your entire workforce. You situate executive pay within the context of that. You actually have to deal with your contracted workers so that if you're saying that you're doing a living wage, you're actually making sure your contractors are doing that well. Important things like racial inclusion, Me Too, all that stuff could be done at the board. And where, Lenore, where I see that could be coming in is we might be able to experiment with works councils at non-union companies if that was under the aegis of a workforce committee like that, with some strong guarantees against non-circumvention. And if you put that together with a living wage, which I strongly support, and the revival of a real National Labor Relations Act, I think you're moving towards something. And it works best, and I'll finish with this. As we all know, it works best within a stakeholder model of capitalism like the Delaware Public Benefit Corporation, because in a European company, all the directors have to care about all the stakeholders, which means the stockholder elected directors have no more or no less than a conflict with the worker elected directors. Everybody has to treat everyone with respect, and there's a balancing of interests. So I think if we could move towards that, but what I'm just saying, my only tweak on what Lenore said is I do think we need that ground up approach to support what happens at the top, because it's really a ground up and top down system. And the workers on the ground floor, like Janie, and their participation in the Works Council also provide information and a source of candidates to the board. And it's a really rich way of governing. And frankly, I always find it funny, I'll finish with this, all the high-end people who talk about socialism, blah, 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 where do they buy all their fancy products? Like, where do they buy their cars from and their watches? They're from a lot of the countries that have co-determination, because there's really high quality products and high functioning companies that American investors have been investing in for years. So there's nothing really scary about moving in this direction. And because 99% of the American public gets more of their wealth from their job than from investing, having a more balanced system will move a lot towards closing not just the equality gap along racial lines, but along the whole society. And so if you move in the direction, you're actually helping people who are trying to save for retirement. They're going to have more money to actually invest. And we're going to all benefit and frankly have high quality products and services. That's what the German and Scandinavian experience shows. Those are high functioning economies. And I think what we're really just talking to is sort of moving in that direction.
Yeah. So Janie, I mean, I want to get your view on this as somebody who's worked at one of these firms for a while, or did work at it for a while. I mean, what do you think would be effective in terms of giving the frontline workers, the employees in the stores, more of a voice in decisions about pay and benefits and time off and schedules and so on?
Well, I'm a big believer in having Walmart associates on corporate boards. I believe this will improve outcomes for associates and provide a sense of corporate democracy and better decision making. Who's closest to the problems and the solutions? The associates are. So for them to be able to voice be the voice at the top, that means that they could tell executives what other associates and consumers think and how to solve these issues immediately instead of waiting years. Take family leave policies at Walmart, for example. Full-time associates now have paid family leave at Walmart because we fought for it. And in the process and in manners that executives weren't used to, Walmart associates kept telling headquarters this was needed, and they just kept ignoring us. Associates made this change by organizing, but we could do much more if we had a seat at the table. Board representation means real partnership where associates have power to guide decisions in a better, more humane way.
Hey, Bharat, let me just hop in here a second, because I agree with everything that's been said here. But I do want to sort of underscore Judge Strine's point. I think that at some point there is an important component of changing the fiduciary duty of the board members. And if you don't do that, you will put worker representatives at a significant disadvantage. And we have seen this happen in the pension funds that workers control. And when the changes were made that trustees were responsible for putting, the economic benefit of the trustees of the beneficiaries of the fund at the forefront, and that was the only thing trustees could care about. What you have seen, around the board of trustees tables at so many pension funds is workers oftentimes turning over to the professionals, all of the decision-making responsibility. So it's the actuaries and it's the fund consultants and it's the attorneys who make all of the decisions, because they are the ones that come to the table with the expertise to be able to do that. And it has been instilled in the minds of so many worker trustees that they will be sued, right, if they don't follow the advice of those consultants. And unless you change, right, the duties that the directors have of a corporation, you run the risk of the same thing happening. So it can't just be the simple thing of sort of saying workers need to have representation. You have to fundamentally change the framework with which the board of directors has to consider and make decisions. And it's critically important, or it will just be representation sort of for optics, but it won't really be true representation.
Yeah, well, that's great. And that actually flows nicely into the second idea, which is, again, to change the charters or the obligations under which boards operate under. So more than 3,000 American companies have already voluntarily gone that route by incorporating as benefit corporations. But of course, the vast majority of American companies still operate under traditional charters. So I'll start with you, Rose. Do you think American corporations should be required to operate under a B Corp-like charter? Or if not required, do you think they should at least be pushed in that direction through tax incentives or some other approach that encourages companies to operate under that model?
Well, I think the idea that you have to serve more than just the financial shareholder should be incorporated into charters. Now, it's difficult when companies have already gone public and they've gone public with a specific charter to then go back and retroactively change it. But what I would hope is that there's enough pressure, kind of like the college students pressuring their colleges to divest of fossil fuels, right? There's enough external pressure from the consumer as well to not purchase or buy products from companies that aren't making these commitments, that aren't willing to pay a living wage, that aren't willing to commit to gender diversity, racial diversity, and all forms of inclusion. If companies not doing those things, then people, I think the new shoppers, the millennial shoppers, the Gen Z shoppers are much more aware of who they buy from. And so I think there'll be a shift, a natural shift that'll happen, but I think as much pressure as we can put on the existing system, to deliver really concrete and measurable changes, like, call out the Business Roundtable on the fact they haven't done anything, call out other corporate actors. I think giving them the framework of the benefit corporation, which does require you to change your charter and to embed into your charter, what your principles are and what you stand for, how you're helping your community, what your commitments are to your employees. I think it's really important. And I hope to see that kind of pressure just continues to mount. It will naturally, because of the wide gap of income inequality that there is right now. I mean, there'll be a revolution, if people don't wake up and realize that they need to. Leah's laughing at me.
I get it. And,
we're there. We're at the
Rose, I was going to agree. I actually think there's a few things building. Like Delaware actually took a very important step just this month. The Governor Carney signed into law to make it, with a simple majority vote, you can convert to public benefit corporation status. I actually heard someone called me yesterday about an existing public company thinking of doing just that. We've seen some going publics, Bharat, that are in this. And so I think there's a group that we still haven't focused on enough, and this is where our institutional investors come in, because they've also talked some big talk about sustainability and about things. They still don't focus on the employees, which is why I say double ESG or E instead of ESG. You got to have the employees in there. But one of the ways to call them out, Rose, is to say, where are you? If a company wants to change to public benefit corporation status, Vanguard, Fidelity, State Street, BlackRock, T. Rowe, who have ordinary American savings and index investing in particular, are you going to support them? And will the union fund support them? I mean, one of the things we need to do in the next administration, obviously, is reverse these catastrophically benighted Department of Labor things, which are putting pressure on institutional investors to go in the wrong way. One other thing, though, that fits in this category, Bharat, is I think leveling the playing field between public and private companies is really important. And we used to piggyback off the SEC disclosure regime to have a window into the economy. That's an outdated thing. We haven't updated the SEC's charter for years. And I think supplementing a move towards this is a requirement that all companies, public or private, report along certain metrics on how they treat their workforce, how they treat the environment, how they treat their communities, whether they comply with the law. That's not just relevant to investors, and the SEC's charter, Bharat, doesn't give them the authority to deal with that. And I think, and I'll finish with this on this, aligning it, is require the institutional investors then to also report on how they give weight to those factors, whether they're actually, if they're an index fund, voting in an index fund specific way that recognizes that you hold the whole market and that your investors are workers, and that treating workers fairly, not externalizing costs, is really important to them. To actually put pressure on those large interests also to step up to the plate, I think would really support the companies then in implementing in a real way this stakeholder form of governance.
Yeah, as you know, as a New York State chartered bank, we were not eligible to be a benefits corporation, but we're able to find a way recently to change our organization certificate to essentially mimic the benefits corporation components. And we got almost 100% shareholder approval from that, largely because the proxy advisors ultimately decided sense. But when you looked at why they recommended it, it was very specific, and it said, well, this might not, I won't get the exact wording right, but it was something like, well, this would not make sense for many companies. For a company like Amalgamated that wears it's sort of social responsible marketing on its sleeve, it makes sense for this company. And that was exactly how they talked about it, inherently sort of saying, we probably wouldn't support this at another company.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That leads nicely into the next area, which is about the role of institutional investors, right? So as Leo said, there's been another shift over time in the sense that a handful of big asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard have big stakes in most of the big corporations in America. They are the primary shareholders in these corporations, and they're voting their shares on behalf of hundreds of thousands of investors. And they're a critical piece of this puzzle, right? So in other words, you could either have corporations shift away from caring only about their shareholders, or another way of looking at it is you could get shareholders to care more about the things that normal people care about, right? Which is not just making absolutely the most amount of money all the time, but also paying people well, protecting the environment, and so on. So as you noted, Leo, the Department of Labor in this Trump administration has gone backwards on a lot of these issues and actually forbidden these fiduciaries from considering ESG, as you said, environmental, social, governance factors in making decisions. So Keith, maybe I'll start with you and then open it up to everybody. What kind of reforms do you think we need in the institutional investor space?
Yeah, so I think that's right. One of the sort of hidden sort of technical secrets of what happens in the public markets is so many of those big shareholders, when it comes to voting on issues at individual companies, they don't take the time to actually sit and assess the votes that they're making themselves. They have outsourced that responsibility to a couple of proxy advisor firms who advise them and come up with a set of principles on how they evaluate that. Those proxy advisors control anywhere from 40 to 60% of the votes at many publicly traded corporations, and it's not that individual voters like Vanguard decide to differ from that very much. So I really think, and this is in our arcane piece, but I think, spending some time with them, and sometimes that's with the worker capital that has, influence here to really influence how those advisors think about the value of, broader stakeholder capitalism to the value of corporations would be an important piece to do. And then obviously, I think the other piece, and Judge Strine hit on it here, is we do need, you need measurable impacts here. And there has been some work, in the environmental area in particular to come up with good metrics to look at and be able to measure companies' ability on this. Very, very little work done in the area of human capital or some of the social impact areas. There's been some work led by the UAW Pension Fund Benefits Trust to do find better metrics on this, and the Trump SEC has pretty much just shut that down. And so but I think you need to have, measurable impact so that you can see that there are real demonstrable ability to change and improve the lives of workers, like Janie and others who are fighting to have just sort of a dignified ability to go to work each day.
And Bharat, I don't want to take long on this, but I'll echo Keith, and I would just say another area besides the authority of the SEC that needs to be addressed is the Department of Labor. The statutory framework by which they regulate fiduciary funds and pension things doesn't take into account the influence that these funds now have in actually our corporate governance system. And I think we should actually be mandating that index funds, for example, because of the thing that they actually have voting policies and other things that take into account their stuck in nature and the universal nature of it, that they actually have to take into account externalities such as, if we're all destroyed as humanity, it's going to be great for our portfolio. And so I think there's some updating that we could do there as well, and I think I would say that's a go to our folks in Congress, which is stop writing letters to the Department of Labor and the SEC, asking them to do things they really don't have the authority to do, and maybe give them the right authority and then hold them accountable, but kind of do it in the right order. And we may have an opportunity next year, in the next couple of years, to do some of that stuff,
No, thanks. I appreciate that. And actually, it reminds me of this great cartoon. I don't know if you have seen it. It was in the New Yorker. It shows sort of these two guys in business suits that are tattered, huddled over a fire. And it's like a nuclear wasteland in the background. And the one guy is saying to the other, at least we maximize shareholder value. Another idea that I want to get Janie's take on to start is to give workers a stake in the company by giving them equity, right? And there's a lot of different companies that have employee stock ownership plans. There's some ideas in Congress for sort of supercharging those so that workers have an even bigger share of the company. And so I guess the basic idea is that if shareholders are going to have so much power, one way to empower workers is to make them more like shareholders. Janie, I'm curious for your perspective on that, and then maybe we can go to Lenore after that.
When it comes to associates being able to share, I guess you could say, in the wealth, that's what they need. They're in these stores every day working hard, and right now during this time they're working extra hard, and they're not being compensated for it, so right now the morale's low. Associates are not feeling like Walmart even really cares about them at all. And honestly, that's just what it is. To me, it just seems like they don't care. Working through a pandemic and not being able to get hazard pay, or not being able to, or having to choose, whether you go to work or stay home and be fired. It's a lot. And I think that if Walmart would at least help their associates to feel like they don't have to struggle, they don't have to, worry about how they're going to eat or feed their families or pay their bills, it would help. It would help a lot. It really would. Associates right now, they're struggling, and Walmart's not doing anything to help.
Yeah, and as you know, and Janie's shareholder resolution would have given workers a share of those buybacks whenever Walmart did it, which is obviously a way of allowing them to share in some of that wealth. I mean, Lenore, I'm curious for your take on this category of ideas.
Yeah, I think, the first thing I'll just say is I think so many of these ideas, as others have said, need to work together. So I think there's a way in which the employee ownership of equity could actually be really effective, when it's put in place together with fundamental changes so that workers are actually empowered inside the company to make decisions about the distributions that go to all shareholders. So representation on boards, and I totally agree with the point earlier about works councils. I don't think about this as what you said, Bharat, I wouldn't think about it as making employees more like shareholders. I think employees are employees. They're the ones who create the value for the company. And so I think it's about, as Janie said, a fair, how do we use the kinds of structures and the tools that we have to actually make sure that workers are sharing in the wealth that they create. Granting equity is one way to do that. But I think that it's important for their role as, creators of value to be really respected, and for all the reasons we know and that Jamie said. And so I think it could be a really interesting thing to pursue. A lot of people don't know how widespread employee ownership is at the medium level or in sort of medium-sized companies in the US today. It's incredibly productive and beneficial for workers, and certainly something that I hope we continue to explore. I'll just say the last thing is that we cannot see it as a replacement for $15 an hour minimum wage across the country, much higher wages and fair labor, fair benefits for workers across the country. It can in no way be any kind of replacement for labor compensation.
And Lenore, I was going to echo that. I think the problem with this focus is so many Americans really don't understand the inequality that exists in our society. They really don't understand that the median family income is closer to $50,000 to $60,000 than it is to $100,000. And they don't understand how narrow the investor class is, even in the middle class. And one of my suggestions would be, how about every employer, after they pay a minimum wage, that there's $1,000 a year that goes into a 401k that doesn't have to be matched, that's in company stock. And then there's a match of after that. So that, because I think, Janie, what you're also saying is you got bills to pay. There's all kinds. It's nice to talk about retirement savings. A lot of people actually have to save for college before retirement. And so I think if we're doing this, as Lenore, I'm sort of echoing what you're saying, is it has to be something that goes along with providing employees with the ability to provide for their families in a dignified way and then meet the bills they pay every month. If you can do something extra on top of that, and that's why I think a 401k is sort of a match using company stock, and not even a match, like a grant for the folks to give them something every year, that could be a really good thing. But it's got to take into account the fundamental economics. And employees, the way they should be mostly sharing in the gains of capitalism is through fair raises. And if you can't give a sustainable raise, give a bonus, like you give a dividend. Give a special dividend, give a special bonus. But really, employees need that in their pay. And if they get enough pay, they can save for retirement for themselves. And no group of people cares more about the productivity and profitability of the company than the employees. Because the employees know if the company doesn't make money, they don't have a job.
Yeah. So with the few minutes that we have remaining, I want to hit one last topic before we wrap up, and that is executive compensation. So, over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in executive compensation overall, and that's related in large part to the fact that CEOs began being compensated primarily in shares. And so, of course, regardless of what other factors you might change, if the executives of the company, if their financial interests are tied closely to the share price, then you're going to probably have a strong incentive to manage to increase the share price, either in the short term or in the long term. So maybe I'll start with Rose and then go to Keith as our two executives on the panel. And what are your thoughts on that category of reforms and what might need to happen there?
Well, I think, I've been in public and private companies, and I think this drive in the public company to have the share price be, the primary focus of the executives is really driven by the investor class, right? Because they're driving that as well. And so, but this strange like explosion of CEO pay and these huge packages when someone fails. I mean, like it's just unbelievable to me, and I think that it's a big problem. It's a board level problem and a governance issue. And I think it needs to be addressed, that's why I like the benefit corporation structure. It brings transparency to the CEO pay versus, the average worker pay. And I just think if a company is creating a lot of value, then great, the CEO should share in the value, as should all the employees share in the value. But reform around these incredibly big packages while, you're not paying a living wage to your employees is to me a kind of, I don't know. It's a kind of greed and you know, view of the world that is so reductive to me that I feel like it's boards that are letting this happen. It's investors that are letting this happen. They set the CEO compensation and they need to change. You know, the same boards that are fighting paying a living wage are giving these huge packages to their CEOs.
Right.
You know, it's it's really nuts. I mean, yeah.
Keith, I'll let you get the last word here, and then we got to wrap up.
Amen to Rose. It creates a whole system of sort of disincentives to think about short-term issues, not long-term issues. Every public company's compensation system looks exactly the same now. There's no ability to distinguish it and reward executives for anything other than delivering maximum shareholder value. And if you tried to run a public company and did anything else, you'd be sort of punished by your shareholders for doing that. So it creates a lot of things. And just to maybe, you know, put one, you know, ounce of dissonance in the last conversation, I'm not so sure, you know, substituting equity in the company for, you know, a real share of the wages wouldn't actually potentially have some of the same impact, you know, deep into the organization, and could actually create fissures amongst workers. And I think it's an important, I think it requires a lot of discussion. I'm not sure it's got some attributes of sounding like, you know, a real equitable way of doing it. I think it's got some dual edgeness to it. And I think it requires a lot of careful consideration.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. We've hit the end of our time here. I really appreciate everyone's time on the panel. I want to thank Congressman Khanna again for his comments to kick us off today. I mean, look, I think that as you can tell, there are a lot of interesting ideas for reform in this space. I think everyone agreed that this is a serious problem that lies at the heart in many ways of a lot of the fundamental issues that we see in our economy that existed before this pandemic, and that I think have become more clear over the course of the pandemic. This is also an area where I think there's been significant bipartisan interest over the years and recently. And so I think you could really see some interesting reform in the months and the years ahead. So again, thank you everyone. Thanks to all the people watching. I hope it's been informative, and the Roosevelt Institute will continue to work on these issues. Thanks.
Thank you.